This is Billy Kay, welcoming you to my series on Scotland's Black history, originally broadcast in 2003, but updated to include new approaches by cultural historians like Dr. Michael Morris of Liverpool, John Moores University.
William Davidson, another radical Scottish Jamaican who came back to Aberdeen to do his schooling in mathematics, but ran away instead to become a revolutionary. He takes part in the Cato Street conspiracy, looking to blow up the cabinet in London, but they were found out and they were raided by the Bow Street runners. The story is that William Davidson was carried out by his arms and legs, singing Scots Wha Hae at the top of his voice. I think that's an absolutely true story, and I'm going to go with it 100%.
Thinking of Burns's song, Scots Wha Hae, which is about the American and the French Revolution, so it ties in perfectly with the image of a black Scot singing a revolutionary song.
Absolutely. In fact, the interesting thing about Scots Wha Hae is we have it as there's certain national context there. It was picked up actually by revolutionaries and reformers and subversives all across the land as well as in America. And so it became a kind of an anthem that we might think of for those who were seeking a better future.
Now's the day and now's the hour, see the front o' battle lower, see approach proud Edward's power, chains and slavery. But regarding slavery, Burns left an ambivalent legacy. Programme 2, Will Ye Go to the Indies?
At the west end of Jamaica, around the port of Savannah-la-Mar, the whole countryside is littered with place names that make you think you're back in Scotland. A lot of the plantations were named after Scottish towns and villages. Haddo, Fort William, Glasgow, Braco, New Galloway, New Milne, Strathbogie, Drummond. And you also find names cropping up like Wallace, like Campbell, Gordon, Gillespie, Robertson. All these names existed in Jamaica, and they are a direct result of the Scots' involvement in the slave system.
You're seeing very tight territorial relationships between small, well-defined areas in the colony and specific neighbourhoods in the old country. In Tobago, for example, there was a single coherent Scottish network operating in the later 18th century, including merchants, planters, doctors, attorneys, from a triangle bounded by the northeast towns of Elgin, Huntly and Banff.
Professor Tom Devine and novelist James Robertson on the West Indies, a corner of the former empire which will remain forever Caledonia, on the map at least. Few Scots are aware of the connection and are astonished when it confronts them. Geoffrey Palmer, a Jamaican who's Professor of Brewing at Heriot-Watt University, recalls a colleague's reaction when he came across his black namesakes.
He went to Jamaica on a holiday and his name is Sharp. And when he came back, he wrote me a note. He says, Jeff, I went to a little village. And he says, 80% of the people there were Sharps. So I said, well, that's where your great-great-grandfather went. And those are your relatives.
There was a huge network of Argyll Campbells and Malcolms, reputedly at least 100 strong, concentrated in the parishes of Hanover and Westmoreland in the west of Jamaica. Even with place names such as Campbelltown, Argyll and Glen Isla scattered throughout this particular area.
The Campbells in Jamaica have a fascinating historical pedigree, as the progenitor of the clan, Colonel John Campbell, was a survivor of the Darien scheme, which attempted unsuccessfully to plant a Scottish colony in Panama, his ship calling in to Jamaica for provisions on the way home. Campbell blamed the duplicity of the English for the failure of the colony and was so disgusted by the Union of 1707 that he left Scotland and settled in western Jamaica. His descendants, mostly black, are there to this day. During the colonial period when sugar was king, over a third of the white population was Scottish. Jeff Palmer recalls his childhood experience in a Kingston church.
By the altar, there's a plaque, and it says, Scottish Achievers. And it had a long list of You know, Burns, Bell, James Watt, etc. And I'm sure nobody in that church, because they're all black people, had a clue who these people were, but they knew they were Scottish. We had a knowledge of also the country in terms of we sang the songs, you know. By on Bunny Banks and by on Bunny Braes. We had a Scottish minister. He never taught to say anything other than to sing. And I mean, you could misbehave during any other class except singing. And he would just have us singing, "My love is like a red, red rose," "Coming Through the Rye," Loch Lomond. And of course, a lot of us bear the names. My mother is a Lamond. I remember I asked her, I said to her, my mother's 95, and I said to my mother, "Where did you get that name?" In a very wry, a very Scottish way, she says, "The black Lamonds lived at the bottom of the hills and the nearly white ones lived at the top." So the white colour had gone because of the mixing, but there was still a distinction on colour. And my mother was born in New Green. Now, New Green is like New York. It's New Greenock. So here we have a heritage, which to me is very important and has a bearing how Jamaicans think. And Jamaicans are people who feel that they have got a heritage that is linked to this country and somehow feel they're very much part of it without any great sense of animosity.
It's hard to imagine why animosity would be absent, as the Union opened up the English colonies and the Scots took immediate advantage in sugar plantations which were considered among the most brutal in the empire.
The plantation overseer, the merchant, the lawyer, the doctor, the army officer, if you like, the middle cadre of immigrants. Now there is clear evidence of that particular group taking immediate advantage of the opportunities. And it's partly because not very many middle-class English people wanted to venture into these lethal areas.
You get a kind of gestalt of this, where the great English lady is dying, and the man at her bedside waiting to pick up her money is the insidious Scots doctor.
Angus Calder. Between 12 and 20,000 Scots settled in the West Indies in the later 18th century, political patronage from home helping them gain power and prominence in islands such as Antigua, but they were also found trading in the Dutch and French colonies as well. Janet Shaw toured what she called the little paradise of the islands in the 1770s and recorded the lavish hospitality of the Scots planters in her Journal of the Lady of Quality. "We were entertained by a whole company of Scotch people, our language, my manners, our circle of friends and connections all the same. Out with the mansions though, the population was 85% black, the slaves held in check by a regime which condoned mutilation and slow, systematic burning alive for runaway slaves."
She accepts the fact that routine brutality was occurring. And on the one hand, she admits that it must appear, as she puts it, dreadful to a humane European, but then points out there's another side to it, because the Negroes, as she puts it, have to be seen as subhuman and therefore cannot actually suffer pain in the same way as whites. And therefore to her, and therefore I presume to her class, cruelty to this particular group is more acceptable. She writes as follows: "When one comes to be better acquainted with the nature of the Negroes, the horror of it all must wear off. As to the brutes, it inflicts no wound on their mind, whose natures seem made to bear it, and whose sufferings are not attended with shame or pain beyond the present." Horrendous, isn't it?
Indeed, but every aspect of human relationships is warped by the banal everyday reality of the peculiar institution of slavery, as revealed in the archives of Glasgow's Mitchell Library by Rachel Taylor. First though, historian Polly Root with a letter home from the slave trader John Calhoun.
"Sir, I have a very fine girl, about 12 years of age. I have had her 18 months with me. She is very smart and will learn anything that is shown to her. I have a great regard for the girl, and I don't mean to sell her. If my sister Betty will accept her, I shall send her home. She can speak good English, and I was the first white man she ever saw. If Betty will not have her, you may ask Janet if she will be of any service to her, and she shall have her. If not, I know not what to do with her, as I never shall sell her. She has been more service to me than any white woman that I ever knew except mother. If it please God to spare me my life for 2 or 3 more years until I come home, she will be more careful over me in my old age than any white I can get. What is particularly moving about this letter is it is testimony to the precariousness of the captive's experience. On the one hand, we may consider that this young girl is lucky in the sense that she would be far better off working in a Glasgow household than she would on a plantation. But I think any of us would be absolutely horrified at the prospect of ourselves or our children being discussed as items to be given to one person or another, to say on the one hand that he cares deeply about this girl, and then in virtually the same sentences, don't know what on earth I'm going to do with her if I can't unload her on Sister Betty. It's very powerful, unwitting testimony to the great vulnerability of girls and women who are always less likely to come through the historical record. And of course, in fact, we don't know what happened to this girl.
This is an account book from the Sterling of Cure collection, and they had plantations called Hampden and Frontier in Jamaica, sugar plantations.
Flicking the pages, it's in beautiful copperplate writing, and it's got lists of the steers and the bulls and the mares that they have, and all of them are listed by their name. The mares are called Friday, Lucy, Cherry. And then you flick over a page, and similar names, but these are the valuation of their Negro slaves.
They've got 105 men, 31 boys, 88 women, and 24 girls.
Some of them are worth a lot of money. Peter and Sandy and James, £140, £120. And some of them are worth...
This is Margaret's worth £1. Harriet worth 10. They were assessed on their ability to provide work for the estate, and their value would go down if they were ill or if they were disabled in some way. There were possessions that were counted as assets to the estate in financial terms, well, more than their terms as a person.
There's about 3 pages just of lists of human beings. Field hands, sawyers, boilers, mulemen, doctors, carpenters. Most of them have been changed to English names, but some still have vaguely African names. Yaba, Suki, Kwashiba.
Fergus was a Scottish name. He's worth £70.
There's one called Fife, Old Fife.
Lysander, a very classical name, is a sawyer, worth 140. There are field girls, 1 year old, 2 years old, up to 8 years old.
These are called Nelly and Mimba and Marina and Beneba. Beneba's 1 year old and listed as part of the stock of the plantation.
Racism, one can document this rather precisely, does arise in the era of slavery, and it arises with the justification by slave owners of their practices. To claim that the person whom you have enslaved, which is morally abhorrent, you are justified to enslave because he's not really a human being at all, is in a sense the essence of slavery. Just as the Nazis in the Second World War claimed that Jews and Slavs were not human beings at all.
The death rates in the Caribbean were much higher than in North America. And the explanation for this seems to be that, particularly in the West Indies, planters did not believe, at least until the 1770s and 1780s, when slave prices started to rise quite rapidly, they did not actually believe in breeding a new generation of slaves. They simply wanted to buy them, as they put it, as salt water blacks straight off the slave vessels because they were cheaper. So they could simply and quite literally often work them to death. It was only when that economy became difficult as slave prices started to rise from the 1770s, 1780s, that they start to look how to improve slave conditions, how to bring in more doctors, for example, and therefore breed a new generation of unfree labour.
And in 1786, But for the success of a certain Kilmarnock edition of poetry, another young Scot called Burns would have arrived to work as a plantation bookkeeper.
If you read Burns and look at his letters, you'll find that he had applied to go to Jamaica, I think, 3 times. He seems to love the country. He talks about Savlamar, that's one of the ports, and he talks about going across the hills to Port Antonio. So he had a very, very good knowledge of the geography. I find that, extraordinary.
Will you go to the Indies, my Mary, and leave out Scotia's shore? Will you go to the Indies, my Mary, across the Atlantic road? Oh, sweet grows the lime and the orange, and the apple on the pine. But all the charms of the Indies can never equal thine.
You have to ask, how on earth would Burns have reacted to what he found there? Would he have protested? Would he have organised a slave rebellion? Would he have come home because he was so scundered by it? Or would he have succumbed to yellow fever, which is what a lot of white people did when they got there? We don't know the answer.
Most people, say like Burns, talked about not being a slave. But somehow the concept of black slavery wasn't in the consciousness of white people as such. And I think that Burns writing about the slave's lament and let's go to the Indies, Mary, and he talks about oranges and all different kinds of fruits and sort of stuff which he was going to get. And I think somehow it was a sort of a romanticising people suffering.
Burns never reached the Indies, but he did compose the Virginia Slave's Lament, and you hope that is where his heart was. In Scottish literature, though, returning wealthy hot-blooded planters begin to appear as characters in novels like John Galt's Annals of the Parish.
Will you go to the Indies, my Mary, and leave out Scotia's shore? Will you go to the Indies, my Mary, across the Atlantic road?
The exotic was becoming familiar. Alex Murdoch of Edinburgh University.
As the empire came home, racial imagery became mixed. I've come across references to Highland tacksmen being described as similar to bold Negro slaves who would commit suicide rather than accept enslavement when they refused estate reorganization and refused to accept higher rents for Highland tax. Equally, I've come across correspondence where a Highland tacksman, writing to his estate owner, described himself as like the Indian who said to Governor Trelawney, "Here I stand, I am part of this land." And finding out later that Governor Trelawney was the British governor of Jamaica in the 1730s and 40s at the time of the Maroon Wars. So that we have Highland tacksmen familiar with details of recent West Indian history.
The American historian Alan Carus calls his book on the Scots planters Sojourners in the Sun, and for many it was the sojourn of their dreams, where every form of sensual excess could be sated, using force if necessary. There was no law to condemn you, and your peers applauded you for siring children who increased the profits of the plantation.
Very few of them take their wives and children with them. Many of them indulge in relationships with young female black slaves and very often have children by them, but they tend not to bring them back to Scotland when they come back. So there's a kind of separate life going on for them in places like Jamaica, and it's like perhaps a more brutal and more sordid world where you can make a lot of money and then you come back and you leave that behind when you re-establish yourself as a laird in Perthshire or wherever it happens to be.
Another document that we came across was a manumission which was granted by William Stirling to a mulatto boy named Charles, who I think, was about 10 years old. He was son of a Negro slave named Cuba. The document doesn't make clear why he was freed. It does say that John Sterling of Kipandavie is the person who wanted him freed, and he paid 10 shillings to William Sterling for this manumission.
Sometimes they freed their own children, and the fact that it's a mulatto boy suggests that it's probably the father freeing his son.
They had signed a document saying that when they died, their son or daughter should be free. And the woman with whom they've had the children, the slave woman, they would leave small amount of money for her. And they may also buy the freedom of the mother. So somehow, to me, all those stories shows that with human nature, underneath the hard, cold exterior, you know what belongs to you and what you're responsible for.
But recognition of responsibility was rare. It was usually ta-ta to the Indies for good. The Wedderburn brothers, for example, had escaped Scotland as Jacobite outlaws in 1746, but returned in triumph as rich plantation owners, buying Scottish estates and respectability a few decades later. The past, though, came back to haunt them.
One of the Wedderburns had a son by a black woman who became a notorious figure in Regency London, writing atheistical pamphlets and running a sect of Christian diabolists. He's one of my favourite people. Even more favourite is his grandmother, who was called Talkie Amy, who was an obey woman. In other words, she practised African magic. Talkie Amy brought up young Robert and taught him to despise that mean Scotch bastard who was his father.
Robert Wedderburn, the son, turned up in Edinburgh to see his father. I think he thought he would be accepted, as I think children do regarding their parents. And of course, the father by that time had bought Inverest Lodge. So of course, Robert Wedderburn turned up at the house. You know, you talk about guess who's coming to dinner, 18th century style. And Robert Wedderburn then, I think, went to the press. And actually, there were letters between James Wedderburn, white son, and his black son in the press. And interestingly enough, the press took his side. And he was one of the first black activists in London, went to prison for his anti-racist work. And the irony is, he's got a drawing in the British Museum. So he is one of the better known Wedderburns.
You've now heard of James in Inveresk, but his brother John and his slave Joseph Knight were central to a famous incident in Scottish legal history in the late 1770s. James Robertson has turned the story into a novel.
I'd thought that I was quite familiar with 18th century Scotland, but what I had not fully appreciated before was the extent to which the economy was fuelled by slave labour on the plantations several thousand miles away in the West Indies and in America. And Joseph Knight seemed to me a very important figure because he's the one figure that emerges and stands, as it were, for those other forgotten figures, and who triumphs by winning his freedom in the highest court in the land.
The intellectual case against slavery was argued by the great men of the Scottish Enlightenment, such as Adam Smith, John Miller and James Beattie, but even the economic arguments were being questioned. Ian White.
The first petition was in 1788. Strangely enough, it was from the Edinburgh Chamber of Commerce. And you might think that was not going to be in the front line of the abolitionist movement. But it starts off by saying, even though there may be a commercial disadvantage to getting rid of the slave trade, which we don't believe, but even if we did believe that, on grounds of humanity, this is a terrible thing and it must be stopped.
It was against this backdrop that the Knight-Wedderburn case was heard, and among all of the Ken Speckle law lords of the time, only a few were pro-slavery. Even men considered to be on the extreme right in their day. Dundas and the famous hanging Judge Lord Braxfield argued against the institution on moral grounds.
Lord Affleck, Boswell's father, is also very, very strong against the idea of slavery. He sums up his argument very succinctly like this: "Is a man a slave because he is black? No, he is our brother, and he is a man in a land of liberty with his wife and child. Let him remain there." One of the strongest arguments that was used was by John Maclaurin, who was one of Knight's advocates, and he invokes Scottish liberty. He goes back to Tacitus' quoting the Caledonian leader Calgagus, and he then invokes Wallace and Bruce and says, if we the Scots have fought for our own liberty in the past so resolutely, then surely we must fight for the liberty of this man here today in the same way.
The particular Scottish intellectual dimension to the wider debate is gratifying, but were we any better or worse than the average European of the day?
I've been told by some colleagues that Scots were happy to sit in the lecture halls of the Scottish Enlightenment and learn about the importance of human freedom, but equally happy to ignore those lessons when they went out into the world of the empire to try to make their way.
There were something like, I think, 517 petitions from Britain to the House of Commons against the slave trade, 184 from Scotland, which is a staggering total. I think certainly, judging by the number of petitions, we were a lot better. I know that Thomas Clarkson, who visited Scotland in the early 1790s to try and prepare the ground, he went several times to France and found it very difficult. Because after the French Revolution, officially slavery was abolished, but it was brought back by Napoleon. And I think the French abolition movement had a very much harder time than the English one. I think the English one had perhaps a harder time than the Scottish one. I don't want to make us out to be the advocates of freedom, but I do think there was a kind of basic feeling that something quite wrong, that people should be held in slavery because they're black.
In the next programme, however, I'll be looking at a record in Virginia and on Banks Island, a Scottish-owned slave station in the Sierra Leone River in West Africa. But I'll end with the Court of Session decision that gave hope and inspiration to people suffering in bondage all over the empire.
The decision that they come to by a majority is very, very clear. They uphold the decision of the Sheriff of Perth that nobody can be a slave in Scotland regardless of their race, colour or origin, and that the minute somebody sets foot in Scotland, they must be a free person. And they also reject the idea that Wedderburn can send Joseph Knight back to Jamaica. Now he's in Scotland, he is governed by the laws of Scotland, and he is a free man.